In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there once lived a priest the townspeople feared more than the spirits he preached about. By the time he turned 42, whispers of missing families, strange midnight rituals, and a church that never opened its doors after dark surrounded his name. This is the story of Nathan Crowe, the most sinister priest Appalachia has ever known. Before we get into this chilling tale, make sure you're subscribed for more forgotten Appalachian mysteries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far this community reaches. Now, imagine a mountain community cut off from the outside world, where faith was the only thing stronger than fear. Nathan Crowe arrived as a man of God, but the longer he stayed, the more people wondered if he served something far darker. Today, we're peeling back the layers of secrecy surrounding Crowe's life, his church, and the grim events that turned him into a legend whispered only in the backwoods of Appalachia. In the winter of 1887, 17 people disappeared from Harlan County, Kentucky within a span of 3 weeks. No bodies were ever found. No ransom demands were made. No witnesses came forward. The sheriff's records from that year contain only one sentence about the incidents. Investigation suspended by order of the county magistrate. For over a century, historians have avoided this story. Archives have been sealed. Family trees end abruptly. And in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, there are still homes where people will not speak the name Nathan Crowe after sundown. This is the account of what happened in those mountains. What you're about to hear has been assembled from court documents that were never meant to be public, from diaries discovered in wall cavities, from testimony given in closed hearings, and from the few survivors who broke their silence in the years before their deaths. The first disappearance was recorded on January 4, 1887. Thomas Hadley, a coal miner aged 34, left his home in the early morning darkness to walk the 3 miles to the mine entrance. His wife Sarah watched him leave through the kitchen window. She would tell investigators that she saw him reach the tree line at the edge of their property, pause for a moment, and then continue into the woods. Thomas Hadley never arrived at the mine. His supervisor marked him absent. His fellow miners assumed he was ill. When he didn't return home that evening, Sarah Hadley walked to her nearest neighbor, nearly a mile away, and reported him missing. The search began the following morning. 47 men from the surrounding communities gathered at dawn. They split into groups and combed the forest along the route Thomas would have taken. They found his lunch pail. It was sitting on a flat rock approximately 1 mile from the Hadley home, placed carefully as if someone had set it down intentionally. The tin was unopened. Inside were the biscuits and dried beef Sarah had packed for him. What disturbed the searchers was the location. The rock where the lunch pail was found sat 30 feet off the established path, deep enough into the undergrowth that someone would have to deliberately leave the trail to reach it. There were no footprints leading to or from the rock. The ground was frozen solid from the January cold, but there should have been some disturbance in the frost-covered leaves. There was nothing. The search continued for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Sheriff William Blackwood called off the effort. He told the assembled volunteers that they had covered every square foot of forest within a 5-mile radius. They had found nothing else. No clothing. No signs of struggle. No indication of where Thomas Hadley had gone. Sarah Hadley refused to accept this conclusion. She spent the next week walking the same paths, calling her husband's name until her voice gave out. On the 9th day after his disappearance, she stopped searching. She returned home and began the process of arranging her life as a widow. But Thomas Hadley's disappearance was only the beginning. On January 11th, 7 days after Hadley vanished, 2 children failed to return home from school. Margaret and James Porter, ages 9 and 11, attended the one-room schoolhouse in Whitley Hollow. Their father, Robert Porter, ran a small farm 3 miles from the school. Every day the children walked the route together, leaving at dawn and returning before dark. On January 11th, they left school at the usual time, 3:30 in the afternoon. The schoolteacher, Miss Elizabeth Warren, watched them start down the road. She would later testify that the children seemed in good spirits and showed no signs of distress. They never arrived home. Robert Porter went looking for his children when darkness fell and they hadn't returned. He carried a lantern and walked the entire route to the schoolhouse, searching both sides of the road. He found nothing. At the schoolhouse, he woke Miss Warren and demanded to know what time his children had left. She told him 3:30, as usual. She had watched them walk down the road together. She had seen nothing unusual. Porter organized a search party that same night. 20 men with lanterns and torches spread out across the countryside between the school and the Porter farm. They searched until dawn without finding any trace of the children. When daylight came, they expanded the search. The entire community turned out. Women brought food for the searchers. Men took time away from their work to join the effort. They searched for 5 days. On the 5th day, they found Margaret Porter's school slate. It was discovered in the hollow of an old oak tree, approximately 2 miles from the school, in a direction that would have taken the children away from their home. The slate was undamaged. Margaret's name was written in chalk on the wooden frame, just as she had written it at the beginning of the school year. The tree where the slate was found stood alone in a clearing. The ground around it had been trampled by the searchers, making it impossible to determine if there had been any other signs of the children's presence. The discovery of the slate should have provided some direction for the search, but instead it created more questions. Why would the children have walked 2 miles in the wrong direction? Why would Margaret have placed her slate inside a tree hollow? And where were they now? The searches continued for another week, but they found nothing else. On January 24th, Robert Porter stood in front of his house and announced that he was offering a reward of $50 to anyone who could provide information about his children's whereabouts. In 1887, $50 represented 2 months' wages for a coal miner. It was an enormous sum. No one came forward. The community was beginning to understand that something far worse than simple misfortune was happening in Harlan County. On January 27th, a third person disappeared. Mary Catherine Simmons, aged 62, lived alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of what was then called Cumberland Settlement. She was known as a midwife and herbalist, someone the community relied upon for healing and counsel. Her cabin sat at the end of a narrow path surrounded by dense forest. Her neighbor, George Whitfield, brought her firewood every Wednesday morning. On January 27th, he arrived at her cabin with a cartload of split logs and found the door standing open. Whitfield called out to Mrs. Simmons. When she didn't answer, he approached the cabin cautiously. He pushed the door fully open and looked inside. The cabin was empty, but what Whitfield saw inside troubled him deeply. Mrs. Simmons' breakfast was still on the table. A bowl of porridge half-eaten. A cup of tea stone cold. Her shawl hung on its peg by the door. Her boots stood beside the fireplace. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold ashes. Whitfield would later tell investigators that it looked as though Mrs. Simmons had simply stood up in the middle of her breakfast and walked out of the cabin. But she had walked out without her shawl, without her boots, on a January morning when the temperature was well below freezing. He checked the outhouse. He walked the perimeter of the property. He searched the nearby woods, calling her name. There was no response. George Whitfield went directly to Sheriff Blackwood and reported what he had found. By this point, Sheriff Blackwood was beginning to recognize a pattern. 3 disappearances in less than a month. No bodies, no evidence of violence, no witnesses. Each victim had simply vanished, leaving behind only small, puzzling clues that led nowhere. He organized another search party, though the men who assembled were noticeably fewer in number than those who had looked for the Porter children. Fear was taking hold in Harlan County. People were beginning to stay close to their homes. They traveled in groups. They avoided the forest. The search for Mary Catherine Simmons lasted 2 days. On the second day, they found something that would haunt the community for decades. In a clearing approximately 1 mile from Mrs. Simmons' cabin, the searchers discovered a circle of stones. The stones had been arranged deliberately, each one about the size of a man's fist, placed at regular intervals to form a perfect circle roughly 12 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle was a pile of ashes. The ashes were recent, no more than a day or 2 old according to the men who examined them. When they sifted through the ashes, they found the remains of what appeared to be bundles of dried herbs. Sage, rosemary, something else they couldn't identify, but they found nothing else. No evidence that Mary Catherine Simmons had been there. No indication of what the circle of stones meant or who had created it. Sheriff Blackwood photographed the stone circle and recorded its location in his official notes. Then he ordered the circle destroyed. His deputies kicked the stones apart and scattered the ashes. When asked why he had destroyed what might have been evidence, Blackwood said only, "Some things are better left undiscovered." This decision would prove to be catastrophic, because the stone circle was the first tangible connection to what was happening in Harlan County. It was evidence of intention, of purpose, of something being carried out according to a plan. And by destroying it, Sheriff Blackwood had eliminated the one clue that might have allowed the community to understand what was coming. The disappearances continued. On February the 2nd, 4 people vanished in a single night. The victims were members of the Calloway family. Father Benjamin, age 41. Mother Ruth, age 38. Their daughters Elizabeth, age 16, and Anne, age 14. The Calloways lived in a sturdy log house on a hillside overlooking Clover Fork. Benjamin Calloway worked as a blacksmith, and his shop stood adjacent to the family home. The family was well regarded in the community, known for their hard work and their devotion to the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. On the morning of February 3rd, Benjamin's apprentice, a young man named Daniel Foster, arrived at the blacksmith shop to begin the day's work. He found the shop locked and the house silent. This was unusual. Benjamin Calloway was known for rising before dawn. He was always the first person awake on his property, usually lighting the forge before his family had eaten breakfast. But on this morning, the forge was cold. Daniel knocked on the door of the house. There was no answer. He walked around to the back and tried that door as well. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and called out. The silence that greeted him was complete. Daniel Foster entered the house. Later, he would struggle to explain what he found there. The house was in perfect order. Beds were made. Dishes were clean. The table was set for breakfast, with plates and utensils laid out for 4 people. But there was no food on the table, and the kitchen fire had gone out hours earlier. Daniel searched every room. He looked in the cellar. He checked the barn and the outbuildings. The Callaway's horses were in their stalls. The chickens were in their coop. The family's winter coats hung on pegs by the front door. Everything was exactly where it should be, except the Callaway family themselves. Daniel ran to the nearest neighbor nearly half a mile away. Within an hour, a dozen men had gathered at the Callaway property. They searched the house again, more thoroughly this time, looking for any clue about where the family might have gone. In Ruth Callaway's sewing room, they found her Bible open on a table beside her chair. The page was marked at the book of Job, chapter 1. Someone had underlined a single verse in pencil. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. No one could explain why Ruth Callaway had underlined this particular verse. No one knew if she had done it recently or months earlier, but the image of that open Bible marked at that specific passage would remain in the minds of everyone who saw it. The search for the Callaway family was the largest effort yet mounted in Harlan County. Over 100 people participated. They combed the hills and hollows for miles in every direction. They dragged Clover Fork, thinking perhaps the family had drowned. They checked every abandoned cabin and mine shaft in the area. They found nothing for 4 days. On the 5th day of searching, a farmer named Isaac Benton made a discovery that would change the nature of the investigation completely. Benton was searching a dense section of forest approximately 3 miles from the Callaway property when he noticed something unusual about one of the trees. It was a massive white oak, easily 200 years old, with a trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have linked hands around it. Carved into the bark of the tree about 6 feet off the ground was a symbol. The symbol consisted of a circle with 3 lines radiating from its center like a crude drawing of the sun. But the lines didn't extend beyond the circle, they stopped at its edge, creating the impression of something contained, something trapped inside the boundary of the circle. Below the symbol, also carved into the bark, were 4 vertical lines, like tally marks, like someone keeping count. Isaac Benton stood looking at that tree for a long moment. Then he walked in a straight line away from it, deeper into the forest. After 50 yards, he found another tree with the same symbol carved into it. Same circle. Same 3 lines. Below it, a single vertical mark. Continued walking. Every 50 yards, he found another marked tree. He found 7 trees in total, each one bearing the same symbol, each one marked with a different number of vertical lines. When Benton reported what he had found, Sheriff Blackwood assembled a team and returned to the forest. They traced the line of marked trees. The line ran roughly northeast to southwest, cutting across the landscape in a direction that seemed to follow no natural features. It didn't follow the ridge lines or the creek beds. It simply cut straight across the terrain, as if someone had walked through the forest with a specific destination in mind. They followed the marked trees for over 2 miles. The line ended at a cliff face overlooking a deep ravine. At the base of the cliff, they found the remains of a fire. The ashes were recent, perhaps only a few days old. Scattered around the fire were more bundles of burned herbs. And there, pressed into the soft earth beside the fire, were footprints. The footprints belonged to several different people. Men, women, children. The investigators counted at least 8 distinct sets of prints. The prints led to the fire from various directions, then stopped at the edge of the ashes. There were no prints leading away from the fire. It was as if the people had walked to that spot and then simply ceased to exist. Sheriff Blackwood ordered his men to search the ravine below the cliff. They spent the rest of that day and all of the next climbing down into the ravine and searching its length. The ravine was steep and treacherous, filled with loose rock and fallen timber. At its deepest point, the drop from the cliff top to the ravine floor was over 80 feet. They found no bodies. They found no evidence that anyone had fallen from the cliff. They found nothing at all that could explain what had happened to the people whose footprints surrounded that fire. On February 8th, Sheriff William Blackwood wrote a letter to the governor of Kentucky. In that letter, which is preserved in the state archives, Blackwood described the disappearances and requested assistance from the state militia. He wrote, "We are faced with circumstances that exceed the capacity of local law enforcement. 17 citizens have vanished without trace or explanation. The community is in a state of terror. People no longer venture from their homes after dark. The churches are filled every evening with prayer meetings. There is talk of abandoning the county altogether and relocating to safer regions. I have exhausted all conventional investigative methods. I have consulted with tracking experts, with physicians, with clergymen, and with anyone who might offer insight into these events. No one can provide a satisfactory explanation. I am writing to request immediate assistance. We need additional men. We need resources. And we need someone with authority beyond that of a county sheriff to take command of this situation before we lose control of the population entirely." The governor's response arrived 2 weeks later. In it, he declined to send the militia. He suggested that Sheriff Blackwood contact the federal marshals if he believed a federal crime had been committed. Otherwise, the matter remained a local concern. Sheriff Blackwood did contact the federal marshals. He sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Louisville, explaining the situation and requesting help. The reply came within 24 hours. No federal jurisdiction, unable to assist. Harlan County was on its own. The disappearances had now claimed 17 people in just over a month. The pattern seemed to show no logic. The victims varied in age from 9 to 62. They included men, women, and children. They came from different parts of the county, from different social classes, from different walks of life. The only thing they seemed to have in common was their residence in Harlan County. And then, on February 14th, 1887, everything changed. A witness came forward. His name was Jacob Miller. He was 23 years old, a logger who worked in the forests above Pine Mountain. He had been staying with relatives in Leslie County during the time of the disappearances, and he had only recently returned to Harlan County. When he heard about the missing people, he went directly to Sheriff Blackwood with information. Jacob Miller told Sheriff Blackwood that he had seen something 3 months earlier in November of 1886. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but now, in light of what had been happening, he believed it might be relevant. Miller had been working in a section of forest near Black Mountain, cutting timber for a lumber company. The work was hard and the days were long. The crew typically worked from sunup to sundown, taking only a brief break for their midday meal. On a cold morning in mid-November, Miller had separated from the rest of his crew to scout a stand of suitable trees. He walked perhaps a quarter mile from where his fellows were working, following a game trail that led up the mountainside. That's when he saw the gathering. In a natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding hills, Miller observed approximately 20 people standing in a circle. They were too far away for him to make out faces, but he could see that they wore ordinary clothing. Work clothes. Farm clothes. Nothing that marked them as unusual. What struck Miller as strange was the time of day and the location. It was the middle of a workday morning. These people should have been at their jobs or tending their farms. Yet here they were, deep in the forest, miles from the nearest settlement. Miller crouched behind a fallen log and watched. He couldn't hear what the people were saying, but he could see that they were focused on something in the center of their circle. Someone was standing there addressing the group. A man, though Miller couldn't make out any details about him. The gathering lasted, perhaps 15 minutes. Then, in a coordinated movement, all 20 people turned and walked away in different directions, disappearing into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. Within moments, the clearing was empty. Miller returned to his crew and mentioned what he had seen. His fellow loggers laughed it off. One suggested it might have been a prayer meeting or church gathering. Another joked that Miller had probably seen a group of moonshiners checking on their stills. No one considered it worth investigating further, but now, 3 months later, with 17 people missing, and the county in a state of crisis, Jacob Miller wondered if what he had seen was connected to the disappearances. He couldn't explain why he felt this connection, but the feeling was strong enough that he had come forward, despite knowing he might be dismissed as a crank or an attention seeker. Sheriff Blackwood listened to Miller's story carefully. When Miller finished, Blackwood asked him a single question. "Could you find that clearing again?" On February 15th, 1887, Jacob Miller led Sheriff Blackwood and 6 deputies back into the forest where he had witnessed the gathering. The weather had turned cold again after a brief warming spell, and fresh snow covered the ground, making the terrain treacherous. They walked for 3 hours, climbing steadily up Black Mountain. Miller admitted several times that he wasn't entirely certain of the route. The forest looked different under snow, and he had only been to this location once before. But he pressed on, relying on his memory of landmarks and the general direction he had traveled. Around midday, they found the clearing. It was exactly as Miller had described it. A natural amphitheater surrounded by steep hillsides on 3 sides, open to the south where weak winter sunlight filtered through bare branches. The snow in the clearing lay undisturbed except for the tracks of deer and smaller animals. Sheriff Blackwood and his men spread out and began searching the area systematically. They looked for any sign that people had been there recently, any indication of what purpose the gathering might have served, any clue that might connect this place to the disappearances. For the first hour, they found nothing. Then Deputy Frank Morrison, searching along the eastern edge of the clearing, called out. The others converged on his location. Morrison was standing beside a large boulder that had clearly been moved at some point. The ground beneath where the boulder had originally sat was disturbed, and when they looked closely, they could see that someone had dug a shallow hole there. The hole was approximately 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. At the bottom lay a wooden box. The box was crude, constructed from rough-cut planks and held together with iron nails. It had no lock, just a simple latch. Sheriff Blackwood pulled the box from the hole and carried it to the center of the clearing where the light was better. He opened it. Inside the box were papers, dozens of sheets covered in handwriting. Some of the papers were folded, others were loose. There were also several small items: a woman's brooch, a child's toy soldier, a man's pocket watch, a ribbon. Blackwood spread the papers out on a flat rock and began reading. The others gathered around him, looking over his shoulder. What they saw in those pages would fundamentally alter their understanding of what was happening in Harlan County. The papers were letters, personal correspondence, but they weren't addressed to anyone in particular, and they weren't signed with full names. Instead, each letter was marked with a symbol at the bottom. That same circle with 3 lines radiating from its center that had been carved into the trees. The letters described a philosophy, a way of understanding the world that was completely foreign to the men reading them. They spoke of transformation, of elevation, of achieving a state of being that transcended ordinary human existence. They referenced biblical passages but interpreted them in ways that would make any Orthodox Christian recoil. One letter, written in a careful, precise hand, contained the following passage: "The flesh is a prison from which we must escape. It binds us to the earth, chains us to suffering and decay. But there is a path to freedom, a method by which the spirit can be liberated while the body yet lives. This is the great work we have undertaken. This is the purpose for which we have been called together." Another letter in a different handwriting described what it called the necessary threshold. "Pain is the doorway through which we must pass. Fear is the guardian we must overcome. Only by confronting the absolute limit of human endurance can we break through to the other side. The weak will fall away. The strong will be transformed. We must not flinch from what is required." Sheriff Blackwood read through every piece of paper in that box. His hands were shaking by the time he finished. When he finally looked up at his deputies, his face had gone pale. "This is a cult," he said quietly. "We're dealing with a religious cult of some kind." The implications were staggering. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence or the work of a single deranged individual. They were organized, planned, carried out by multiple people working together towards some shared goal. And if the letters were to be believed, the goal involved death. Blackwood ordered his men to search the clearing again, this time looking specifically for graves or burial sites. They worked until darkness began to fall, probing the ground with long sticks, looking for any place where the earth had been recently disturbed. They found nothing. If bodies were buried in this clearing, they were buried so well that no surface evidence remained. As night approached, Sheriff Blackwood made a decision. They would camp in the clearing overnight and resume the search at first light. He wanted to be certain they hadn't missed anything. The deputies protested. None of them wanted to spend the night in this place. The forest had taken on a menacing quality as the sun set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. But Blackwood insisted, and his word was law. They built a large fire in the center of the clearing and arranged themselves around it. 2 men would stay awake at all times, keeping watch while the others slept. They had their rifles and their revolvers. They told themselves they were perfectly safe. The first hours passed without incident. The men took turns keeping watch, feeding the fire, stamping their feet against the cold. The forest around them was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional crack of a tree branch contracting in the freezing air. Around midnight, Deputy James Hartley, who was on watch with Deputy Morrison, heard something moving in the woods to the north of the clearing. He woke the others immediately. All 7 men stood with weapons ready, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound came again. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps, crunching through the snow. Moving slowly, deliberately, circling around the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Blackwood called out, "Who's there? Show yourself!" There was no answer, but the footsteps stopped. The men waited, hardly breathing, straining to see into the shadows. The fire cast flickering light that made it impossible to distinguish real movement from the play of shadows. Then they heard it. A voice speaking from the darkness. A man's voice, calm and unhurried. "You shouldn't be here." "Come into the light," Blackwood commanded. "Let us see you." "No," the voice replied. "This place belongs to us now. You need to leave." "I'm Sheriff William Blackwood of Harlan County. I'm ordering you to show yourself." There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again, and now there was something like amusement in its tone. "Your authority means nothing here, Sheriff. This ground has been consecrated to a higher purpose. You're trespassing." One of the deputies, a young man named Thomas Webb, raised his rifle and fired into the air. The shot echoed across the hills, impossibly loud in the quiet night. Webb shouted, "The next shot won't be a warning." The laughter that came from the darkness was soft, almost gentle. "You think your weapons frighten us? We've already passed beyond fear. We've already died and been reborn. There's nothing you can threaten us with." Then the voice changed, became harder. "But we can threaten you. We know your names. We know where you live. We know your families. If you don't leave this place right now, we'll come for them. One by one, just like we came for the others." Sheriff Blackwood made a decision that he would question for the rest of his life. He ordered his men to gather their gear. They were leaving the clearing immediately. The deputies didn't argue. They broke camp in less than 5 minutes, throwing their bedrolls over their shoulders and grabbing their rifles. The box of letters and personal items was left behind in their haste, a decision Blackwood would bitterly regret. They left the clearing and began making their way down the mountain by the light of 2 lanterns. Behind them they could hear movement in the forest, multiple sets of footsteps now, keeping pace with them as they descended. The 7 men walked close together, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness on all sides. The footsteps followed them for over a mile before finally fading away. By the time they reached the main road just before dawn, they were alone again. They made it back to the county seat by mid-morning on February 16th. Sheriff Blackwood went directly to his office and wrote an extensive report of what they had found in the clearing and what had happened during the night. He included detailed descriptions of the letters they had discovered, writing from memory since the originals were gone. That afternoon, he called a meeting of the county officials and community leaders. 23 people gathered in the courthouse. Sheriff Blackwood presented his findings and his conclusion. Harlan County was dealing with an organized group of religious extremists who had already killed at least 17 people and would likely kill more. The reaction to this announcement was immediate and chaotic. Several people spoke at once. Questions were shouted across the room. Accusations were made. Within minutes, the meeting had devolved into an angry, frightened mob. County Magistrate Edwin Crawford finally restored order by firing his pistol into the ceiling. When the room quieted, he addressed Sheriff Blackwood directly. "You're telling us that there's a cult operating in this county. A murderous cult. And you're telling us that you don't know who these people are, where they're based, or how to stop them. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Blackwood replied. "Then what exactly do you propose we do?" Blackwood had been thinking about this question all morning. "We need to identify the members of this group. Someone in this county knows who they are. Someone has seen something, heard something. We need to question everyone, door to door if necessary. And we need to do it quickly before they kill again." Magistrate Crawford nodded slowly. All right, I'm authorizing you to deputize as many men as you need. I'm also placing the county under a state of emergency effective immediately. No one travels alone. No one goes into the forest. Anyone seen behaving suspiciously will be detained for questioning. We're going to find these people, Sheriff, and when we do, we're going to hang them. The investigation that followed would become one of the most intensive manhunts in Kentucky history. Over the next 2 weeks, Sheriff Blackwood deputized 47 men. They conducted interviews with virtually every household in Harlan County, asking questions about unusual behavior, strange gatherings, people who had expressed unconventional religious views. The interviews produced remarkably little useful information. Most people were cooperative but could offer nothing concrete. A few reported seeing small groups of people walking through the forest at odd hours, but they couldn't identify who these people were or where they had been going. Several interviewees mentioned a traveling preacher who had passed through the county the previous autumn. This preacher had held services in various communities, delivering sermons that some found inspiring and others found troubling. But no one could agree on what the man had looked like, what name he had given, or where he had gone after leaving Harlan County. One elderly woman, Catherine Bright, told the investigators something that caught their attention. She claimed that in late October she had been walking near the Cumberland River when she encountered a man standing alone on the riverbank. The man had been dressed in black and was staring intently at the water. When Mrs. Bright approached and asked if he needed help, the man had turned to her and smiled. He had the strangest eyes, she told the deputies. Not frightening exactly, but intense. Like he could see right through you, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "The water remembers everything. It knows all our secrets." Then he tipped his hat and walked away into the trees. The deputies asked Mrs. Bright if she could describe the man more fully. She provided a detailed description. Approximately 40 years old, tall and lean, dark hair going gray at the temples, clean-shaven, well-spoken with an accent she couldn't quite place. He had worn a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and he had carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. This description was added to the investigation file. Several other people, when shown this description, said they thought they might have seen someone matching it at various times over the previous months. But no one could say definitively who the man was or where he might be found now. The investigation was yielding frustration but little progress. And then, on March 1st, exactly 8 weeks after the first disappearance, something happened that would break the case wide open. A letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The envelope was addressed to Sheriff William Blackwood in careful, precise handwriting. There was no return address. The postmark showed it had been mailed from Cumberland, a small community about 15 miles from the county seat. Sheriff Blackwood opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the bottom of the page was that familiar symbol, the circle with 3 lines radiating from its center.